Hey guys, tonight we drift into the stone-cold corridors of medieval monasteries, where men devoted their lives to God and discovered that divine service came with a side of perpetual misery. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle for the authentic medieval ambience, and let's ease into tonight's journey through centuries of holy suffering together. When most people think of medieval monks, they picture peaceful men in brown robes, tending gardens, copying manuscripts and humming hymns in candlelit chapels. It's a romantic image, full of spiritual serenity, scholarly pursuit, and quiet contemplation. The reality was somewhat different. Imagine spending your entire adult life in what amounted to a religious prison, where every moment was regulated, every pleasure forbidden, and your daily routine involved equal parts prayer manual labor and slowly starving to death for the glory of God. The monastic life wasn't just difficult. It was systematically designed to break the human spirit in the name of salvation. Monks didn't just give up worldly possessions. They surrendered their bodies, their minds, their individual will, and often their sanity to institutions that treated suffering as the highest form of worship. And if you think modern life is stressful, try living in a place where sleeping past 3 a.m. was considered a sin. Gluttony could get you beaten, and expressing any human emotion louder than a whisper might result in solitary confinement. But let's start at the beginning, when monasticism first took root in the early Christian world, because understanding why anyone would voluntarily sign up for this requires a deep dive into medieval psychology and a healthy appreciation for just how terrifying the alternatives were. The monastic movement began in the deserts of Egypt during the 3rd and 4th centuries, when Christianity was transitioning from a persecuted cult to the official religion of the Roman Empire. Early Christians faced a spiritual crisis. If martyrdom was no longer available as a path to holiness, how could devout believers prove their devotion to God? The answer, according to men like St. Anthony of Egypt, was self-imposed exile, suffering, and the complete rejection of everything that made life worth living. Anthony spent 20 years alone in a tomb, then moved to an abandoned fort in the desert, where he battled demons' hallucinations and his own sanity for another 2 decades. His biography, written by St. Athanasius, became a bestseller in the ancient world, inspiring thousands of men to follow his example of holy masochism. These desert fathers, as they came to be known, competed to see who could endure the most spectacular forms of self-torture. St. Simeon Stylites spent 37 years sitting on top of a pillar. St. Macarius allegedly stood upright for an entire Lent, refusing to sit or lie down, and countless others embraced poverty, disease, and isolation as expressions of divine love. It was the spiritual equivalent of extreme sports, except instead of adrenaline, the payoff was supposed to be eternal salvation, and instead of lasting a few minutes, the suffering was designed to last a lifetime. By the 6th century, this movement had evolved into organized monasticism, with St. Benedict of Nursia writing his famous rule that would govern monastic life for the next 1,000 years. Benedict's rule was remarkably detailed, covering everything from how much food monks should eat, spoiler alert, not much, to how they should sleep, fully clothed, in case they needed to jump up for midnight prayers, to exactly how many psalms should be recited at each service. The rule promised structure, discipline, and spiritual growth. What it delivered was a lifestyle so regimented that modern prisoners would consider it inhumane. But medieval Europeans flocked to monasteries anyway, some seeking genuine spiritual fulfillment, others fleeing poverty, war, or family obligations. Many had no choice at all. Their parents donated them as children in exchange for prayers or political favors, a practice called oblation that essentially turned monasteries into dumping grounds for unwanted sons. Once you entered a monastery, whether as an adult volunteer or a childhood oblate, there was no going back. The vows of poverty, chastity and obedience weren't just spiritual commitments. They were legal contracts that stripped away every right you'd previously taken for granted. You couldn't own property, couldn't marry, couldn't make decisions about your own life, and couldn't leave, even if you discovered that talking to God 24/7 wasn't quite the fulfilling experience you'd imagined. And that was just the beginning. Because while the spiritual theory behind monasticism was beautiful, the daily reality was a grinding marathon of discomfort designed to crush the ego and purify the soul through systematic misery. Let's talk about the schedule that governed every moment of a monk's existence. Monastic life was built around the divine office, a cycle of 8 prayer services that punctuated every day like spiritual alarm clocks. It began with matins, the middle of the night service that required monks to wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. in pitch darkness, stumble through freezing corridors, and stand in an unheated chapel for 2 hours of chanting psalms in Latin, many of which they'd memorized but might not fully understand. After matins came lauds at dawn, then prime around 6 a.m, terce at 9 a.m, sext at noon, none at 3 p.m, vespers at sunset, and finally compline before bed. Each service involved standing for extended periods, chanting in unison, and maintaining perfect silence between prayers. The cumulative effect was a kind of liturgical waterboarding that left monks in a permanent state of sleep deprivation and spiritual exhaustion. But the prayers were just the beginning. Between services, monks were expected to engage in manual labor study, copying manuscripts, tend to the monastery's agricultural needs, and maintain the buildings that housed their perpetual suffering. The idea was that idle hands were the devil's workshop, so every moment had to be filled with productive activity, preferably activity that was physically demanding and spiritually edifying. In practice, this meant that after standing through 3 a.m. prayers, a monk might spend the morning hauling water from a well tending vegetable gardens, or copying biblical texts by hand in a scriptorium, where silence was enforced, and mistakes were punished. Afternoons might involve more agricultural work, building maintenance or kitchen duties that required handling food they weren't allowed to enjoy. Evenings brought more prayers, followed by a brief period for reading religious texts before the cycle began again. There were no weekends, no holidays, no personal time, and no privacy. Monks slept in dormitories on straw mattresses, wore rough woolen habits that chafed their skin, and owned literally nothing beyond the clothes on their backs. Even their meals were communal affairs, eaten in silence, while one monk read aloud from spiritual texts, ensuring that even the act of eating remained focused on God rather than enjoyment. Speaking of food, let's discuss the medieval monastic approach to nutrition, which can best be described as deliberately inadequate, with periodic forays into outright starvation. The rule of St. Benedict specified that monks should receive 2 meals a day during most of the year, and only 1 meal during Lent and other fasting periods. Each meal was supposed to provide just enough sustenance to keep the body functioning, while avoiding the sin of gluttony. In practice, this meant a diet consisting primarily of bread, vegetables, and whatever protein sources were available locally, and seasonally meat was generally forbidden except for the sick and elderly. Though fish was permitted on certain days, dairy products were allowed, but often limited, and anything that might be considered a delicacy was strictly prohibited. The goal wasn't just to feed the body minimally, but to train it to want nothing. Portion sizes were carefully controlled, with monks receiving measured amounts of bread soup and vegetables, quantities that would leave modern diners wondering where the rest of their meal was hiding. Medieval monks were essentially on a permanent diet that would make modern nutritionists weep. The caloric intake was calculated to maintain basic bodily functions, while ensuring that thoughts of food remained a constant distraction requiring spiritual discipline to overcome. And then there were the fasting periods, which turned an already inadequate diet into something resembling a slow-motion famine. Lent lasted 40 days. Advent involved weeks of additional restrictions, and numerous saints' days throughout the year required special forms of dietary penance during these periods. Monks might eat only once a day, receive even smaller portions, or eliminate certain foods entirely from their already limited menu. The physical effects were predictable: chronic hunger, weakened immune systems, increased susceptibility to disease, and a general state of bodily discomfort that medieval monks interpreted as spiritual purification. Modern doctors would call it malnutrition, but medieval monks called it bringing the flesh into submission to the spirit either way. It involved a lot of very thin, very pale men with sunken cheeks, and the kind of hollow-eyed stare that comes from perpetual caloric deficit. But hunger was just one aspect of the physical discomfort that defined monastic life, because medieval monasteries were not designed with human comfort in mind. They were built to house souls in transit to the afterlife, and souls apparently don't need central heating insulation or basic sanitation. Most monasteries were constructed of stone, which made them impressively durable and monumentally cold during winter months when temperatures inside barely differed from the outdoor weather. Monks wore their woolen habits day and night, not out of devotion, but out of desperate necessity. The chapels where they spent hours each day in prayer were typically the largest and most poorly heated spaces in the entire complex, ensuring that worship involved not just spiritual submission, but also physical endurance against hypothermia. Heating was minimal and largely limited to the kitchen and infirmary, with occasional braziers in the scriptorium, where manuscripts needed protection from moisture. Monks slept in unheated dormitories on thin straw mattresses, with minimal bedding. Many shared sleeping spaces with several other monks in arrangements that provided little privacy and less warmth. The result was a population of chronically cold men who spent their days shivering through prayers and their nights huddled together for survival. Bathing was infrequent, both for practical and theological reasons. Hot water required extensive preparation and fuel consumption that most monasteries couldn't afford, and medieval Christian theology was deeply suspicious of anything that might be associated with bodily pleasure or vanity. Most monks bathed a few times a year, usually during specific feast days, or when their state of uncleanliness became a distraction to prayer. The combination of inadequate nutrition, minimal heating, infrequent bathing, and constant physical stress created ideal conditions for disease to flourish. Monasteries were essentially large-scale experiments in how many forms of illness could be sustained simultaneously in a single population. Tuberculosis spread easily in the close quarters. Dysentery was a constant threat from poor sanitation, and various skin conditions thrived in the unwashed communal environment. But perhaps most destructive to monastic health was the complete absence of medical understanding that characterizes medieval healthcare monks who fell ill, were treated with prayer herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness and bloodletting, a practice that involved deliberately weakening already malnourished patients. Serious injuries or illnesses were often interpreted as divine tests, requiring increased spiritual devotion rather than actual medical intervention. The infirmary in most monasteries was less a hospital than a place where sick monks could die with slightly more comfort than they'd lived their entire monastic careers. Monks who survived into old age did so despite their lifestyle, not because of it, and many who entered monasteries as healthy young men found themselves broken in body long before their spirits achieved the purification that justified their suffering. Yet physical discomfort was only the beginning of monastic hardship, because the real challenge of medieval monastic life wasn't the hunger cold or disease. It was the complete psychological breakdown that resulted from living in a system designed to eliminate individual personality, identity, and emotional expression. Medieval monasticism operated on the principle that the self was the enemy of salvation. Every impulse, preference, desire, or personal characteristic had to be systematically identified and destroyed through a process that modern psychologists would recognize as institutionalized psychological abuse. The goal was to create men who had no opinions, no preferences, no individual will, and no sense of personal identity beyond their function as vessels for divine grace. This process began with the vow of obedience, which required monks to surrender their decision-making capacity to their superiors completely. A monk couldn't choose what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend his time, or even what to think about without permission. Every action had to be approved. Every word had to serve a spiritual purpose, and every emotion had to be suppressed or redirected toward divine contemplation. The abbots and priors who governed monasteries wielded absolute authority over their communities. They could assign punishments, order transfers, determine work assignments, and control every aspect of daily life for the monks under their authority. There was no appeal process, no democratic decision-making, and no individual rights that superseded the collective spiritual mission of the community. This system attracted some genuinely holy men, who used their power to guide others towards spiritual growth. But it also attracted petty tyrants, who enjoyed having complete control over other human beings. Monastic chronicles are filled with accounts of abbots who ruled through fear, intimidation, and arbitrary punishment, creating environments that resembled spiritual prison camps more than communities of religious devotion. The psychological pressure was intensified by the vow of stability, which prevented monks from leaving their monastery, even if conditions became unbearable. Unlike secular prisoners who might eventually be released, monks were trapped for life in whatever community they joined, regardless of how dysfunctional, oppressive, or abusive it became. Individual monasteries developed their own cultures of severity. Some emphasized extreme asceticism, requiring monks to sleep on stone floors, wear hair shirts, or engage in ritual self-flagellation. Others focused on intellectual pursuits, but maintained strict silence that could drive men mad with isolation. Still others became corrupt institutions where the rule was ignored, and monks lived in comfort while maintaining the pretense of holy poverty. But even in the most benevolent monasteries, the basic structure remained. The same human beings were systematically stripped of their autonomy, personality, and individual will in service of an ideal that promised spiritual freedom through complete surrender of everything that made them human. The psychological toll was enormous, and monastic records hint at levels of mental illness, depression, and emotional breakdown that were considered normal costs of spiritual development. The vow of chastity added another layer of psychological torment by requiring monks to suppress not just sexual activity, but sexual thoughts, desires, and even the acknowledgement of their own bodies as anything other than burdens to be transcended. Medieval Christianity viewed sexual desire as evidence of spiritual corruption, requiring constant vigilance and harsh self-discipline to overcome. Monks who struggled with sexual temptation, and that was most of them, were encouraged to increase their fasting, engage in more vigorous physical labor, sleep less, and pray more intensively. The idea was to exhaust the body so completely that it couldn't generate the energy for sexual thoughts or desires. When these methods failed, monks might be assigned to sleep on the floor, subjected to public humiliation, or sent into solitary confinement until their spiritual resolve returned. The result was a population of men who lived in constant fear of their own biology, who interpreted normal human impulses as evidence of spiritual failure, and who spent enormous amounts of mental energy trying to think about not thinking about things that healthy humans naturally think about. The psychological strain was immense, and many monks developed obsessive behaviors, religious scrupulosity, and other forms of mental illness that were interpreted as signs of holiness rather than symptoms of psychological damage. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of monastic psychology was the way it trained men to find meaning in meaninglessness and purpose in purposelessness. The entire monastic project was built on the premise that ordinary human life was worthless, that individual desires were sinful, and that the only way to achieve value was through the complete elimination of everything that made life worth living. Monks spent their days engaged in activities that produced no tangible benefit beyond their symbolic spiritual value. They copied manuscripts that few people would read, grew food they couldn't enjoy, and maintained buildings that housed nothing but their own suffering. The work was endless, repetitive and deliberately frustrating, designed to teach humility through the experience of futility. The prayers that structured their days were recited in Latin, which many monks understood only partially. If at all, they chanted the same psalms day after day, year after year, until the words became meaningless sounds that filled time without providing intellectual stimulation or emotional satisfaction. The entire liturgical cycle was designed to create a kind of spiritual numbness that medieval theologians called holy detachment, but that psychologists might recognize as learned helplessness. Yet monks were expected to find joy in this emptiness, meaning in this meaninglessness, and spiritual fulfillment in the systematic destruction of everything that normally provides human satisfaction. Those who succeeded in this task were praised as saints. Those who failed were considered spiritually weak and subjected to increased disciplines until they achieved the proper state of holy indifference, or broke completely under the pressure. But let's dive deeper into the specific horrors that awaited those brave or foolish enough to actually take monastic vows, because the general misery we've discussed so far was just the appetizer. The main course of monastic suffering involved specialized torments that varied by season, location, and the particular sadistic creativity of individual abbots. Winter in a medieval monastery was essentially a months-long experiment in how close human beings could come to freezing to death without actually dying. Most monasteries were located in northern climates, where temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, and the stone construction that made these buildings impressively durable also made them spectacularly cold. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m., not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of a bell that someone had to ring by hand in the same freezing conditions you were experiencing, then stumbling through corridors where your breath formed visible clouds, and ice sometimes formed on the inside walls of buildings. The chapel where you'd spend the next several hours was typically the largest space in the monastery, which meant it was also the coldest. Monks stood through these early morning services in unheated stone chambers, wearing only their woolen habits and whatever undergarments the rule permitted, which wasn't much. The combination of sleep deprivation, cold, and the physical demands of standing for hours while chanting created a kind of liturgical hypothermia that left monks shivering uncontrollably through prayers. The dormitories where monks slept were marginally warmer than the chapel, but only because multiple bodies shared the same space. Most monasteries housed monks in large communal sleeping areas, with minimal privacy and no individual heating. Monks slept on straw mattresses that provided little insulation from stone floors, and under thin blankets that were often insufficient for the climate. Many monasteries required monks to sleep fully clothed, partly for reasons of modesty, but primarily because undressing in those temperatures would have been dangerous. The sleeping arrangements also meant that illness spread rapidly through communities, creating cycles of communal sickness that lasted throughout the winter months. But winter cold was just one seasonal challenge. Summer brought its own special forms of monastic misery. The same stone construction that made monasteries freezing in winter made them oppressively hot in summer, and the heavy woolen habits that provided minimal warmth in cold weather became instruments of torture when temperatures rose. Summer also meant increased agricultural work, as monasteries needed to grow produce and harvest crops to sustain themselves through the year. Monks spent long hours in fields and gardens under the medieval sun, wearing their full habits because changing clothes or removing garments for practical reasons was forbidden by most rules. The combination of heavy clothing, hard physical labor, inadequate nutrition, and limited water intake created perfect conditions for heat exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke. Medieval monks regularly collapsed while working in summer conditions, but this was typically interpreted as spiritual weakness, requiring increased discipline, rather than medical attention, requiring rest and proper hydration. Summer also brought insects, and the monastery design that kept heat in during winter also kept insects in. During summer, monks lived and worked in environments where flies, mosquitoes, and various parasites thrived without modern pest control or screening. The result was chronic discomfort from insect bites, infections from scratching, and diseases transmitted by insect vectors. But perhaps worse than the seasonal variations were the special observances that punctuated the monastic calendar, turning already difficult conditions into exercises in survival Lent. The 40-day period before Easter was treated as an extended experiment in how little human beings could eat, while still maintaining the energy for their religious duties. During Lent, most monasteries reduced meals from 2 per day to 1, and that single meal consisted of bread, water, and perhaps some vegetables. Meat, dairy, and anything that might be considered pleasurable was strictly forbidden. The idea was to share in Christ's suffering through hunger, but the practical result was a community of increasingly weakened men struggling to maintain their religious obligations, while their bodies slowly consumed themselves. Advent brought similar restrictions, though typically not as severe, and various saints' days throughout the year required additional fasting periods. Some monasteries observed special fasts every Friday throughout the year. Others had elaborate systems of dietary restrictions tied to the liturgical calendar. The cumulative effect was that monks spent much of their time in various states of hunger, but the most extreme ascetic practices were reserved for special observances like Holy Week, the week before Easter, when some monasteries engaged in elaborate ceremonies designed to recreate Christ's passion through communal suffering. These might include extended periods of prostration, where monks lay face down on stone floors for hours, ritual flagellation, where monks whipped themselves or each other with cords or chains, and complete silence that lasted for days. Some monasteries practiced disciplines, like the discipline of the chain, where monks wore metal chains around their waists or limbs as constant reminders of their spiritual bondage. Others required monks to sleep on bare stone floors during penitential seasons, or to stand throughout the night in vigil without sitting or lying down. These practices weren't considered extreme or unusual. They were standard expressions of monastic devotion that separated serious religious communities from those that had grown soft or worldly. The monks who couldn't endure these disciplines were considered spiritually weak, while those who embraced them enthusiastically were held up as examples of proper religious fervour. The medical consequences were predictable and largely ignored. Chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, increased susceptibility to disease, and injuries that healed poorly due to poor nutrition and inadequate rest. But these physical problems were reframed as spiritual opportunities, chances to unite one's suffering with Christ's passion and demonstrate true devotion through patient endurance. Monasteries also developed elaborate hierarchies of suffering, where different levels of ascetic practice corresponded to different levels of spiritual advancement. New novices might be required to sleep on slightly thicker mattresses or receive marginally larger food portions, while senior monks demonstrated their spiritual maturity by accepting the harshest conditions with apparent gratitude. This created communities where complaining about physical discomfort was not just discouraged, but treated as evidence of spiritual pride. Monks learned to hide their pain smile through their hunger and express gratitude for conditions that were slowly killing them. The psychological pressure to appear spiritually advanced often prevented monks from seeking help even when they were seriously ill. The monastic system also created a bizarre economy of suffering, where pain became currency and misery became status. Monks competed to see who could endure the most discomfort, accept the harshest penances, and demonstrate the greatest indifference to their own well-being. Those who complained about conditions were considered proud. Those who sought comfort were labelled weak, and those who questioned the system were accused of lacking faith. This created communities where empathy became a liability and kindness was suspect. Monks learned to hide their own suffering while judging others for theirs. They developed elaborate systems of spiritual accounting, where every comfort was a debt against salvation and every pleasure was evidence of moral failure. The result was not the loving Christian community that monasticism promised, but rather a collection of isolated individuals competing to prove their worthiness through their capacity for self-destruction. The daily routine of manual labour added another layer of physical punishment to monastic life. Most monasteries were agricultural communities that needed to produce food, maintain buildings, and support themselves through the work of their members. This meant that after standing through hours of prayers, monks spent their days engaged in hard physical labour. Agricultural work in the medieval period was backbreaking, even for well-fed, healthy workers. For malnourished, sleep-deprived monks, it was often beyond their physical capacity. But the rule required that all monks participate in manual labour, regardless of their physical condition or ability, age, and illness that might modify work assignments, but they rarely eliminated them entirely. Monks who were too weak to work in the fields might be assigned to kitchen duties, copying manuscripts or building maintenance, but there was no category for monks who were simply too sick or exhausted to work. The assumption was that with proper spiritual discipline, any monk could find the strength to fulfill his obligations. This led to situations where seriously ill monks continued working until they collapsed. Monks with injuries received minimal treatment and returned to work before healing completely, and elderly monks worked until they literally couldn't stand the monastic ideal of finding meaning through suffering. Meant that physical breakdown was often interpreted as spiritual progress. The scriptoriums, where monks copied manuscripts, might seem like easier work than agricultural labour, but they brought their own forms of torment. Monks spent hours hunched over writing desks in poorly lit conditions, copying texts by hand with primitive tools that required constant sharpening and careful maintenance. The physical demands of manuscript copying included eye strain from working in dim light, hand cramps from hours of careful writing, back pain from hunched postures, and respiratory problems from the dust and fumes of inks and parchments. Mistakes in copying were considered serious infractions that might require redoing entire sections of work or accepting punishment from superiors. The intellectual demands were equally challenging. Many monks copied texts in Latin that they understood only partially, if at all they were required to maintain perfect accuracy while copying theological, philosophical, or scientific works that might be beyond their educational background. The pressure to avoid errors, combined with the physical discomfort of the work, created a perfect storm of stress and exhaustion. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of monastic manual labour was its deliberately meaningless character. Much of the work assigned to monks was designed not to accomplish practical goals, but to teach spiritual lessons about humility, obedience, and the vanity of worldly achievement. Monks might be assigned to dig holes and then fill them in again, to carry stones from one location to another and back, or to perform repetitive tasks that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating their willingness to obey. Without question, the goal was to break down ego and pride by forcing intelligent men to engage in obviously pointless activities while maintaining the pretense that the work was spiritually valuable. This type of psychological manipulation was considered advanced spiritual training that separated truly obedient monks from those who still retained vestiges of personal will. Monks who questioned the purpose of their assignments were considered prideful, while those who embraced meaningless work with enthusiasm were praised for their spiritual maturity. The cumulative psychological effect was devastating. Men who had been capable of independent thought, creative problem-solving and meaningful work were systematically trained to find satisfaction in futility and meaning in meaninglessness. The result was a form of learned helplessness that made monks psychologically dependent on their communities for any sense of purpose or direction. Even the educational activities that monasteries provided were designed more to indoctrinate than to enlighten. Monks learned to read primarily so they could participate in religious services and copy manuscripts. They studied theology to reinforce orthodox beliefs, rather than to develop critical thinking skills, and they memorized vast amounts of religious text without necessarily understanding its meaning or implications. The library collections that monasteries maintained were impressive by medieval standards, but access was strictly controlled and limited to materials that supported the community's spiritual mission. Monks couldn't read for pleasure, explore topics that interested them personally, or engage with ideas that might challenge their religious assumptions. This intellectual restriction was particularly cruel for monks who had entered monasteries with genuine scholarly interests. They found themselves in communities with extensive libraries, but were forbidden to use those resources for independent learning or creative thinking. Instead, they spent their intellectual energy copying other people's ideas and memorizing texts they weren't allowed to question. The result was a peculiar form of intellectual starvation, surrounded by books, but forbidden to truly read them, exposed to ideas, but not allowed to think about them independently. Monks became literate in the most technical sense, while remaining intellectually imprisoned by systems that feared the dangers of unrestricted learning. And then there were the punishments, the elaborate systems of discipline that monasteries developed to maintain order and enforce conformity to the rule. The medieval monastic approach to correction involved a carefully graduated series of penalties that escalated from mild public humiliation to complete social isolation. Minor infractions like arriving late to prayers, speaking unnecessarily, or showing insufficient reverence during worship might result in exclusion from communal meals, requiring the offending monk to eat bread and water, while his brothers enjoyed their regular, inadequate, but comparatively luxurious portions. More serious violations could result in temporary expulsion from choir, where the monk was forced to stand outside the chapel during services listening to prayers he wasn't allowed to join. Repeated offences, or more serious violations, might result in excommunication from the community, where the monk remained physically present in the monastery, but was treated as if he didn't exist. Other monks were forbidden to speak to him, acknowledge his presence, or interact with him. In any way, this could last for weeks or months, until the abbot decided the monk had demonstrated sufficient repentance. The most severe punishment was complete expulsion from the monastery, which was essentially a death sentence. In medieval society, an expelled monk had no legal status, no means of support, and no community to protect him. Most became beggars, outcasts, or died of exposure and starvation. The threat of expulsion was so terrifying that monks would endure almost any other punishment to avoid it. But the daily punishments were often more psychologically devastating than the extreme penalties. Minor humiliations were built into the system. As constant reminders of the monk's status, as spiritual children subject to correction by their superiors, monks might be required to prostrate themselves, publicly confess their failures in front of the community, or accept physical punishment, like being struck with a rod during chapter meetings. These corrections weren't administered in anger or as personal vendettas. They were systematic institutional practices, designed to break down ego and pride through regular doses of shame and humiliation. The goal was to create men who accepted criticism gratefully, punishment humbly, and correction as evidence of their superiors' care for their spiritual development. The psychological impact was exactly what you'd expect from a system that combined social isolation with arbitrary punishment and constant surveillance. Monks developed the institutional personality characteristics common to long-term prisoners, including learned helplessness, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and an obsessive focus on avoiding any behavior that might attract negative attention. Yet, perhaps the most insidious aspect of monastic discipline was the way it trained monks to internalize their oppression and interpret their suffering as evidence of divine love. Monks learned to be grateful for punishments that proved their superiors' investment in their spiritual development, to welcome corrections that demonstrated their need for guidance, and to find joy in humiliations that revealed their pride and selfishness. This psychological conditioning was so effective that many monks genuinely believed they were living in paradise. Even as their bodies deteriorated, their minds fractured and their spirits withered under the weight of systematic dehumanization. They wrote letters to their families, describing the peace and fulfillment of monastic life, while simultaneously documenting conditions that any reasonable person would recognize as torture. But beyond the physical hardships and psychological manipulation, the aspect of monastic life that may have been most damaging to human flourishing was the complete elimination of normal social relationships. The vows of celibacy and the structures of monastic community combined to create an environment where healthy human connections were impossible. Celibacy wasn't just about avoiding sexual activity, it was about rejecting all forms of intimate human relationship that might compete with a monk's devotion to God. Monks were forbidden to form particular friendships, show special affection for individual community members, or maintain close relationships with family members outside the monastery. This created communities of men who lived in close physical proximity but remained emotionally isolated from each other. The rule encouraged monks to love all their brothers equally, which in practice meant they were forbidden to love any of them. Particularly, the result was a kind of emotional flatness where relationships remained superficial and guarded. Monks ate together, worked together, prayed together, and slept in the same spaces, but they were trained to maintain emotional distance from each other. Personal conversations were discouraged, expressions of affection were suspect, and any relationship that seemed too close was broken up by superiors who feared it might lead to spiritual corruption. The psychological effects of this enforced emotional isolation were severe. Humans are social creatures who need intimate connections to maintain mental health, but monastic life was designed to prevent exactly those connections from forming. Monks lived in a state of perpetual loneliness, surrounded by people but unable to form meaningful relationships with any of them. This isolation was intensified by the restrictions on contact with the outside world. Most monasteries limited visits from family members, controlled correspondence with people outside the community, and required that any external relationships be mediated through monastic authorities. Monks gradually lost touch with their former lives, their old friendships, and often their families. For monks who had been donated to monasteries as children, this meant they grew up without ever experiencing normal human relationships. They knew their fellow monks, but only within the artificial constraints of monastic life. They had no understanding of friendship, love marriage, or family relationships outside the religious context. Even within the monastery, relationships were complicated by the hierarchical power structures that governed monastic communities. Abbots and priors wielded enormous authority over ordinary monks, creating relationships based on power and submission rather than mutual respect or affection. These power dynamics often became abusive with superiors, using their authority to manipulate control or punish monks who displeased them. The combination of absolute power isolated communities and men who had been psychologically broken by years of systematic dehumanization created perfect conditions for various forms of abuse. Some abbots became tyrants who ruled through fear and arbitrary punishment. Others became manipulative father figures who used emotional control to maintain dominance. Still others simply became indifferent administrators who managed their communities like spiritual factories, focused on productivity rather than human welfare. The monks under their authority had no recourse when relationships became abusive. They couldn't leave, couldn't appeal to outside authorities, and couldn't even discuss problems with other community members without risking punishment for breaking the bonds of obedience and loyalty that were supposed to govern monastic life. Yet, perhaps most tragically, the system often produced monks who became abusers themselves. After years of being systematically dehumanized, many monks lost the capacity for empathy, compassion, or healthy relationships. They learned to find satisfaction in the exercise of power over others, and to interpret their own suffering as qualification for inflicting suffering on others. This created cycles of abuse that perpetuated themselves across generations, as broken men broke other men in an endless repetition of the same patterns of dominance, submission, and psychological destruction that characterized the monastic system as a whole. The sexual frustration that resulted from lifelong celibacy added another dimension to these dysfunctional relationships. Monks were expected to completely suppress not just sexual activity, but sexual desire and attraction. But sexual desire didn't disappear simply because it was forbidden. It went underground and often emerged in distorted and unhealthy ways. Some monks developed obsessive religious practices that provided substitute outlets for sexual energy. Others became preoccupied with sin and temptation in ways that suggested they were constantly struggling with desires they couldn't acknowledge. Still others directed their frustrated sexuality toward inappropriate relationships with younger monks or with people outside the monastery. The monastic response to sexual problems was typically to increase disciplines that made the underlying problems worse. Monks who struggled with sexual temptation were encouraged to fast more, pray more, work harder, and sleep less. The idea was to exhaust the body so completely that it couldn't generate sexual energy, but this approach often intensified the psychological problems while creating new physical ones. Monasteries also developed elaborate systems for preventing sexual contact between monks that created environments of suspicion and surveillance. Monks were forbidden to be alone together, required to keep their hands visible during conversations, and subjected to constant monitoring by superiors, who assumed that any private interaction might lead to sexual activity. This surveillance created communities where trust was impossible, privacy was non-existent, and normal human interactions were interpreted as potential threats to spiritual purity. Monks learned to view each other with suspicion, to report unusual behaviors to their superiors, and to maintain emotional and physical distance, even in the close quarters of monastic life. The result was communities of men who lived in fear of their own desires, fear of each other's desires, and fear of the authorities who monitored their every interaction for signs of spiritual corruption. The psychological toll was enormous, and many monks developed various forms of sexual dysfunction, anxiety disorders, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. But the system persisted because it served the needs of medieval society, even as it destroyed the individuals who populated it. Monasteries provided educational services, social welfare functions, economic productivity, and spiritual services that secular institutions couldn't or wouldn't provide. Monks copied and preserved manuscripts that maintained literary and intellectual traditions. They provided medical care, such as it was to surrounding communities. They operated schools that educated the children of noble families, and they maintained agricultural operations that contributed to local economies. Monasteries also served as convenient dumping grounds for inconvenient family members, younger sons who couldn't inherit landdaughters, who couldn't be married advantageously, and relatives with mental illnesses or physical disabilities could all be deposited in religious communities where they became someone else's responsibility. The spiritual services that monasteries provided were also economically valuable in a society that believed prayer could influence divine favor. Wealthy families paid monasteries to say masses for their deceased relatives, pray for their prosperity, and provide spiritual insurance against divine displeasure. This meant that even obviously dysfunctional monasteries continued to receive financial support, social approval, and new recruits, because they served important social functions regardless of their effect on the individuals who actually lived in them. The human cost of the monastic system was considered acceptable because the spiritual and social benefits were deemed more important. The irony was that many of the social services provided by monasteries could have been provided more effectively by secular institutions, without the unnecessary human suffering that characterized monastic life. But medieval society was so committed to the idea that suffering was spiritually valuable that it couldn't imagine alternative ways of organizing education, healthcare, or social welfare. As the medieval period progressed, the original spiritual intensity of monasticism gradually gave way to corruption, relaxation, and institutional decay. Many monasteries became wealthy landowners, more concerned with political influence and economic power than spiritual discipline. Monks in these communities often lived comfortable lives that bore little resemblance to the austere existence prescribed by their rules. But even in the corrupt monasteries, the basic structure remained the same. Men surrendered their autonomy, individual will, and personal identity to institutions that claimed divine authority over their lives. The main difference was that instead of suffering for spiritual purposes, they suffered for institutional ones. The wealth that many monasteries accumulated created new forms of spiritual corruption. Abbots lived like feudal lords. Monks engaged in political intrigues, and communities became more concerned with maintaining their temporal power than with pursuing their spiritual mission. Yet even wealthy monasteries maintained the pretense of holy poverty, requiring ordinary monks to live in deprivation, while their superiors enjoyed luxury. This created additional layers of resentment and psychological damage, as monks who had surrendered everything for spiritual reasons watched their superiors use the institution's wealth for personal comfort and political advantage. The hypocrisy was staggering, but questioning it was considered a sin against obedience. The corruption also extended to the recruitment practices of many monasteries. As they became wealthy and powerful, they began accepting donations of land money and goods in exchange for accepting new monks regardless of their spiritual fitness or genuine calling. This meant that monasteries filled up with men who had no real desire for religious life, but were there because their families needed to dispose of them conveniently. These reluctant monks brought their own forms of misery to monastic communities. They were often resentful, bitter, and actively resistant to the spiritual disciplines that governed religious life. But they couldn't leave, and they couldn't be easily expelled, so they remained as sources of discord and dysfunction within communities that were already struggling with their own institutional problems. The presence of unwilling monks also created new forms of internal conflict, as genuinely devout men found themselves living alongside others who viewed monastic life as a prison sentence rather than a spiritual calling. The resulting tensions made community life even more difficult and often led to the kind of factional disputes that turned monasteries into battlegrounds of competing interests. But perhaps most damaging to the spiritual mission of monasticism was the way corruption normalized suffering as an end in itself, rather than a means to spiritual growth. When abbots lived in luxury while requiring their monks to endure deprivation, it became clear that suffering wasn't actually necessary for spiritual development. It was simply a tool for maintaining hierarchical control. This realization was devastating for monks who had endured years of hardship, believing it would lead to spiritual reward, when they discovered that their superiors didn't consider such suffering necessary for themselves. The entire theological framework that justified monastic life began to collapse, leaving monks with nothing but the raw experience of institutional oppression. Yet, even corrupt monasteries maintained the external forms of religious observance that had characterized the movement from its beginning. Monks still attended the same 8 daily services, still copied manuscripts, still maintained the same schedules of prayer and work. The difference was that these activities no longer served any meaningful spiritual purpose. They had become empty rituals that perpetuated themselves through institutional momentum. This created a particularly toxic form of spiritual numbness, where monks went through the motions of religious life while experiencing none of its supposed benefits. They recited prayers they didn't believe, copied texts they didn't understand, and participated in ceremonies that had lost all meaning. The result was a kind of spiritual death that occurred while the body continued to function. The psychological impact of this spiritual emptiness was often worse than the physical hardships that characterized austere monasteries. At least monks who suffered for spiritual reasons could find meaning in their pain, but monks who suffered for institutional reasons experienced their hardship as pure futility with no redemptive purpose. As medieval monasticism developed over the centuries, it became increasingly clear that the system was producing spiritual results that were often the opposite of what it claimed to achieve, instead of creating communities of loving, humble servants of God. Monasticism often produced bitter, isolated men who had been psychologically damaged by years of systematic abuse. Instead of spiritual wisdom, monasticism often produced religious obsession and scrupulosity instead of peace and joy. It often produced depression and anxiety instead of love for God and neighbor. It often produced fear, hatred, and emotional numbness. Yet the mythology of monastic spirituality was so powerful that these obvious failures were reinterpreted as signs of spiritual authenticity. Monks who were clearly suffering from mental illness were praised as mystics. Communities that were obviously dysfunctional were admired for their spiritual intensity, and practices that were obviously harmful were defended as necessary for spiritual growth. This cognitive dissonance allowed the monastic system to continue for centuries, despite overwhelming evidence that it was failing to achieve its stated goals. The investment in the mythology was so great that people preferred to ignore reality rather than acknowledge that their spiritual ideals were fundamentally flawed. The decline of medieval monasticism finally began when secular authorities realized they could seize monastic wealth and property while claiming to reform spiritual corruption. But even then, the dissolution of monasteries was motivated more by political and economic considerations than by concern for the human welfare of monks. When Henry VIII dissolved English monasteries in the 1530s, thousands of monks were suddenly expelled from the only life they'd ever known. After decades of institutionalization, they were completely unprepared for ordinary existence. Many became beggars. Some died of starvation or exposure, and few successfully adapted to secular society. The process of dissolution was often brutal and arbitrary. Monks were given minimal notice, minimal compensation, and no assistance in transitioning to secular life. Many had spent their entire adult lives in monasteries and had no skills training or connections that would help them survive outside religious communities. Some former monks attempted to continue religious observances in private, but without the structure and community that had defined their existence, they often found themselves lost and purposeless. Others tried to find work as teachers, scribes, or in other occupations that might use their limited skills. But the job market for former monks was essentially non-existent. The psychological trauma of sudden expulsion after decades of institutional life was often more devastating than the physical hardships of monastic existence itself. Monks who had been systematically trained to surrender all personal autonomy and decision-making capacity found themselves completely unable to function as independent adults. Many former monks experienced what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. They had been conditioned to find meaning only within the context of monastic life, and when that context disappeared, they were left with no sense of purpose, identity, or worth. Similar patterns occurred throughout Protestant Europe, where monastic dissolution left former monks as living evidence of a system that had failed both spiritually and humanly. These men had sacrificed everything for institutions that abandoned them when circumstances changed, leaving them with nothing but the psychological scars of their monastic experience. The Catholic Counter-Reformation attempted to reform monasticism by returning to stricter observance of traditional rules, but this largely meant intensifying the same practices that had caused problems in the first place, rather than addressing the fundamental flaws in the monastic system. Some monasteries did develop more humane practices during the early modern period, recognizing that extreme asceticism often hindered rather than helped spiritual development. But these reforms were limited and came too late to salvage the reputation of monasticism as a viable path to spiritual fulfillment. The reformed monasteries that emerged from the Counter-Reformation often maintained the external structures of medieval monasticism, while moderating some of its harshest practices, but they still required the same fundamental surrender of individual autonomy that had characterized the system from its beginning. Even the more moderate forms of post-medieval monasticism continued to attract criticism from philosophers and social reformers, who argued that any system requiring the complete surrender of individual will was fundamentally incompatible with human dignity and psychological health. By the modern period, most Western societies had concluded that while monasticism might serve certain limited functions as a lifestyle choice for a small number of individuals, it was no longer viable as a major social institution. The recognition that holiness didn't require the systematic destruction of human dignity represented perhaps the only genuine spiritual progress achieved since the medieval period. Yet even today, medieval monasticism continues to fascinate people who live in secular societies, defined by individual freedom, consumer choice, and personal fulfillment. There's something appealing about the idea of complete surrender of responsibility, simplicity, and purpose, even when that surrender comes at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. Perhaps this fascination reveals something troubling about modern life, that in our freedom and abundance, we sometimes long for the clarity that comes from having all choices made for us, even if those choices lead to suffering, or that in our individualistic culture, we occasionally envy communities bound together by shared commitment, even when that commitment requires the sacrifice of individual identity. Or perhaps it simply reflects the human tendency to romanticize historical periods we didn't actually experience, to imagine that past suffering was more meaningful than present comfort, and to forget that the people who lived through historical hardships were real human beings with the same capacity for pain, fear, and despair that we possess. The medieval monks who populated monasteries throughout Europe were not spiritual giants who transcended human nature through divine grace. They were ordinary men who found themselves trapped in a system that promised salvation through suffering and delivered suffering. Without salvation, they deserve to be remembered not as spiritual heroes, but as human beings who endured more than any human being should be asked to endure. Their legacy is not the inspiration they provide for modern spiritual seekers, but the warning they offer about the dangers of confusing suffering with holiness, meaninglessness with transcendence, and institutional authority with divine will. Their lives remind us that the capacity to endure hardship is not the same as the wisdom to avoid unnecessary hardship, and that systems claiming divine sanction for human misery should be viewed with profound suspicion. The monastic chronicles that survive from the medieval period often paint rosy pictures of community life filled with spiritual joy, meaningful work, and brotherhood. But reading between the lines reveals a different story of men struggling with depression, isolation, and despair while maintaining the public facade of religious contentment. Accounts of individual monks who achieved genuine spiritual fulfillment within the monastic system are rare, and often occur despite rather than because of the institutional structures that governed their lives. The saints who emerged from medieval monasteries typically succeeded by finding ways to transcend or circumvent the more destructive aspects of monastic life, rather than by embracing them fully. Even the most successful monastic communities were often those that found ways to moderate the harshest requirements of their rules, while maintaining the appearance of strict observance. The monasteries that produced the greatest scholars, theologians, and spiritual writers were typically those that allowed some degree of intellectual freedom, individual expression, and humane treatment of their members. This suggests that the positive achievements associated with medieval monasticism occurred not because the system was spiritually effective, but because some individuals and communities managed to create pockets of relative humanity within an otherwise dehumanizing structure. The architectural legacy of medieval monasteries stands as perhaps the most enduring testament to the movement. But even these beautiful buildings tell a story of priorities that placed institutional grandeur above human welfare. The magnificent chapels, elaborate cloisters, and impressive libraries were built with resources that could have been used to provide better living conditions for the monks who occupied them. The contrast between the architectural splendor of monastic buildings and the austere living conditions of the monks who inhabited them reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval monasticism. Institutions that claim to value spiritual over material concerns, nevertheless, invested enormous resources in creating impressive physical monuments to their own importance. These buildings also required massive amounts of labor to construct and maintain labor that was provided primarily by the monks themselves, who spent years of their lives hauling stones, mixing mortar, and performing the back-breaking work necessary to create architectural masterpieces they would never be able to enjoy as anything other than settings for their continued suffering. The irony of monks building beautiful chapels where they would spend their lives in uncomfortable prayer-cold workshops, where they would copy manuscripts in poor light, and elegant refectories where they would eat inadequate meals in silence, was apparently lost on the designers and planners who created these institutions. Today, these ruined monasteries attract millions of tourists who admire their beauty, contemplate their history, and often romanticize the lives of the men who once inhabited them. Few visitors consider the reality of daily life within these walls, or reflect on the human cost of the spiritual ideals they represented. The tourist industry that has grown up around medieval monasteries has created its own mythology of peaceful contemplative life that bears little resemblance to historical reality. Guidebooks and tour guides typically emphasize the scholarly achievements, architectural beauty, and spiritual significance of these sites, while glossing over the systematic suffering that characterized the actual experience of monastic life. This modern romanticization of medieval monasticism serves the same psychological function that the original mythology served. It allows people to imagine that somewhere, sometime, there existed communities where human beings found perfect meaning through perfect sacrifice while avoiding the uncomfortable recognition that such perfection requires the destruction of everything that makes humans human. The persistence of monastic romanticism in popular culture reveals our continued fascination with the idea of escape from the complexities and ambiguities of ordinary life through total commitment to higher purposes. But it also reveals our reluctance to examine too closely what such total commitment actually costs. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the medieval monastic experiment was not that it failed to achieve its spiritual goals, but that it succeeded so completely in destroying the human beings who attempted to live up to its ideals. The system worked exactly as designed, producing communities of broken men who had surrendered their humanity in pursuit of holiness and found neither. The monks who survived the monastic system often did so by developing psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to find meaning in meaninglessness and joy in joylessness. But these adaptations came at the cost of their capacity for normal human relationships, emotional expression, and independent thought. In the end, the medieval monastic experiment failed, not because it was too demanding spiritually, but because it was too destructive humanly. It created communities of broken men who mistook their brokenness for holiness, and institutions that survived by convincing new generations to sacrifice their humanity for promises of spiritual reward that never materialized. The monks themselves were both victims and perpetrators of this system, shaped by it, but also shaping it, sustained by it, but also sustaining it. They lived lives of extraordinary sacrifice for purposes that ultimately proved neither divine nor meaningful, and they died, believing their suffering had been worthwhile, when in fact it had simply been suffered. The final irony of medieval monasticism is that the very intensity of its failure may have contributed to its historical persistence. Communities that completely destroyed their members created martyrs to impossible ideals, and martyrs have always been more inspiring than ordinary people living ordinary lives with ordinary happiness. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed with adequate food in your stomach, freedom to make your own choices, and the right to leave any situation that makes you miserable, remember the medieval monks who had none of these luxuries, who spent their lives in stone-cold corridors chanting prayers they barely understood for a God who seemed to reward devotion with increasing doses of misery. Remember Brother Thomas, who entered Cluny at age 12 because his noble family needed to reduce the number of heirs, and spent 60 years copying manuscripts in a scriptorium where speaking was forbidden until he forgot how to carry on normal conversations. Remember Brother Benedict, who developed a persistent cough from sleeping in unheated dormitories, and was told that his illness was God's way of testing his faith until he died at 35 of tuberculosis. Remember Brother Francis, who was beaten with rods during chapter meetings for the sin of falling asleep during midnight prayers after working 14 hours in the monastery fields. and who learned to be grateful for these corrections as signs of his abbot's spiritual concern. Remember Brother Jerome, who spent his final years unable to digest the rough bread and watery soup that constituted monastic meals, but was forbidden to eat anything else, because special diets were considered pride. Remember Brother Augustine, who never learned to read properly because education was limited to religious texts, and who spent 40 years copying Latin manuscripts he couldn't understand, while longing for the secular poetry he'd loved as a child. Remember Brother Peter, who was forbidden to visit his dying mother because such attachments were considered obstacles to spiritual development, and who never saw another member of his family after taking his vows. Remember Brother Martin, who developed severe depression from the isolation and meaninglessness of monastic life, but was told that his despair was evidence of spiritual dryness, requiring increased prayer and fasting until he took his own life in the monastery garden on a spring morning when the world outside was blooming with life he would never experience. Remember Brother David, who was sexually abused by his abbot, but couldn't report it because questioning superiors was considered disobedience, and who spent his remaining years in therapy that consisted of increased self-flagellation and private confession of his own sinful nature. Remember Brother Michael, who tried to escape the monastery after 10 years of systematic dehumanization, but was caught and returned to spend his final decades in solitary confinement as punishment for his lack of spiritual commitment. Their ghosts still haunt the ruins of medieval monasteries, not as spiritual guides, but as reminders of what human beings will endure when they mistake suffering for salvation, and institutions convince them that their pain serves a higher purpose. They whisper through the broken stones and empty corridors, telling stories of lives that were sacrificed not to God, but to systems that claim divine authority while practicing human cruelty. Their voices join the larger chorus of history's forgotten victims, all those who suffered and died for ideals that proved empty, causes that proved worthless, and institutions that proved more interested in maintaining power than in serving the human beings who sustained them. Sleep, well knowing that whatever hardships you face tomorrow, you won't have to face them in a monastery where the only escape was death, and death itself was considered just another form of divine service, requiring proper spiritual preparation and institutional approval. Even the grave offered no privacy for men who had surrendered their lives to communities that claimed to save souls by systematically destroying the human beings who possessed them. And perhaps, in your dreams, you can give these forgotten monks what their lives never allowed them: a moment of warmth, a satisfying meal, a genuine friendship, a choice freely made, a thought freely expressed, a life freely lived, all the simple human dignities that medieval monasticism taught them to despise as obstacles to salvation, but which we now recognize as the very things that make salvation meaningful. May they finally rest in whatever peace exists beyond the reach of institutions that mistake cruelty for love, suffering for wisdom, and human destruction for divine service. Their experiment in holiness is over, their suffering has ended, and their warning echoes through the centuries, reminding us that the road to hell is paved, not just with good intentions, but with systems that claim divine sanction for human misery. Tonight their medieval nightmare is finally over, but their lesson remains forever relevant in a world that still struggles to distinguish between authentic spirituality and institutional oppression, between genuine sacrifice and systematic abuse, between holy suffering and pointless cruelty. They paid the ultimate price for humanity's ongoing education about the difference between serving God and serving the institutions that claim to represent God. Sleep well, dear listeners, and wake tomorrow grateful for the freedoms they never had, the choices they never made, and the simple human dignity they never experienced. Their sacrifice was real, but it was unnecessary. Their suffering was intense, but it served no divine purpose. Their dedication was admirable, but it was misdirected toward ideals that consumed rather than elevated the human spirit. In the end, they were not spiritual failures who couldn't achieve the holiness their system promised. They were human beings who deserved better than a system that required the destruction of everything human in the name of everything holy. And in remembering them, we honor not their surrender, but their humanity, not their suffering, but their endurance, not their system, but their stubborn persistence as human beings, even within institutions designed to eliminate every trace of human dignity. But let's delve even deeper into the specific daily horrors that made monastic life such an exquisite form of sustained torment, because we've only scratched the surface of the creative ways that medieval religious communities found to make existence unbearable in the name of spiritual purification. Take, for instance, the matter of personal hygiene, which in medieval monasteries was treated as both a practical impossibility and a spiritual danger. Monks were expected to maintain some basic level of cleanliness to avoid becoming a distraction during communal prayers, but they were also taught to view any attention to their physical appearance as vanity requiring confession and penance. The result was a delicate balance between avoiding offensive odours and avoiding the sin of caring about their bodies. Most monasteries allowed monks to wash their hands and faces daily, usually with cold water from communal basins that quickly became breeding grounds for various infectious diseases. Full-body bathing was typically restricted to a few times per year, often coinciding with major religious festivals. When bathing was permitted, it was conducted under strict supervision to ensure that monks didn't spend excessive time or attention on their bodies. The water was usually cold. The soap, if any, was harsh and rough, and the entire process was designed to be as unpleasant and utilitarian as possible. Any monk who seemed to enjoy the experience of being clean might find himself assigned additional penances for the sin of sensual pleasure. Dental hygiene was essentially non-existent in most monastic communities. Toothbrushes wouldn't be invented for centuries, and the medieval understanding of dental care consisted primarily of prayer and endurance. Monks cleaned their teeth, if at all, with rough cloth or twigs, and dental problems were treated with herbal remedies that were often more harmful than helpful. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate dental care, and limited medical knowledge meant that most monks suffered from chronic dental pain, infected gums, and tooth loss by middle-age eating became increasingly difficult and painful. But complaining about dental problems was considered a form of spiritual weakness that required increased fasting rather than medical treatment. Clothing presented another daily source of discomfort and humiliation. Monastic habits were deliberately designed to be rough, uncomfortable, and unattractive. The coarse woolen fabric chafed against the skin, causing rashes and sores that were interpreted as spiritual opportunities rather than medical problems. The garments were typically loose-fitting and shapeless, designed to hide the human form and eliminate any possibility of vanity or sexual attraction. Monks were usually provided with two habits, one for daily wear and one for special occasions, but both were expected to last for years with minimal replacement or repair. As the fabric wore out, it became even rougher and more uncomfortable, but requesting new clothing was considered a sign of excessive attachment to worldly comfort. Undergarments, when permitted, were minimal and also made of rough materials. Many monasteries required monks to wear hair shirts, garments woven with coarse animal hair, or even metal threads that provided constant irritation against the skin. These were considered advanced spiritual practices that helped monks remember their fallen nature and need for constant penance. Shoes were often inadequate for the climate and terrain around monasteries. Monks might be provided with simple sandals or rough leather shoes that offered little protection against cold, wet, or rocky ground. Many monasteries required periods of barefoot observance, particularly during penitential seasons, when monks walked on cold stone floors and rough outdoor paths without any foot protection. The daily schedule of prayers and work was punctuated by constant small discomforts that accumulated into a comprehensive system of systematic torment. The bells that summoned monks to prayer were deliberately harsh and jarring, designed to interrupt sleep and create a sense of urgency and anxiety rather than peaceful reflection. The chapels where prayers were conducted were typically designed to be acoustically impressive rather than physically comfortable hard stone floors, uncomfortable seating, or no seating at all. And poor lighting created an environment where worship was associated with physical discomfort and strain. Monks stood for hours in these conditions, often swaying from fatigue or cold, but remaining upright was considered a spiritual discipline. The Latin prayers and chants that filled these services were often recited at speeds that made comprehension impossible. Even for monks who understood the language, the goal was not intellectual engagement with the meaning of the prayers, but rather the creation of a hypnotic, repetitive experience that suppressed individual thought and encouraged spiritual passivity. Between prayer services, monks engaged in various forms of manual labor that were specifically chosen for their unpleasant or meaningless character. Agricultural work was backbreaking and often conducted in harsh weather conditions without adequate tools or equipment. Construction and maintenance projects required monks to haul heavy stones, mix mortar, and perform dangerous tasks without safety equipment or proper training. Kitchen duties involved handling food that monks were forbidden to taste, preparing meals they couldn't enjoy, and cleaning dishes and utensils with harsh soaps and cold water that left their hands raw and cracked. Laundry work required handling rough fabrics and caustic cleaning agents that caused skin problems and respiratory irritation. Copying manuscripts in the scriptorium might seem like pleasant intellectual work, but it was actually a form of refined torture. Monks spent hours hunched over writing desks in poorly lit conditions, copying texts word by word without being allowed to pause, read ahead, or understand the context of what they were writing. The quills used for writing required constant sharpening and maintenance. The inks were often corrosive and stained hands and clothing permanently, and the parchment was expensive and unforgiving of mistakes a single error might require. Starting an entire page over again, and repeated mistakes could result in punishment or reduction of already inadequate food rations. The intellectual content of the text being copied was often deliberately chosen to be as tedious as possible. Long lists of saints' names, repetitive theological arguments, and dense scholastic treatises that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating the monks' willingness to engage in meaningless labor. Libraries in monasteries were impressive collections of knowledge, but access was strictly controlled, and reading for pleasure or personal interest was forbidden. Monks could only read texts assigned by their superiors, and only for the specific purpose of copying or studying them. Independent research curiosity or intellectual exploration were considered forms of pride, requiring correction. Even the books themselves were designed to be uncomfortable, to use heavy volumes bound in rough covers with poor typography and minimal illustrations. Reading required good lighting, which was often unavailable, and the physical act of handling large manuscripts while standing at lecterns was tiring and awkward. The dormitories where monks slept were designed to provide minimal rest while maximizing discomfort and surveillance. Large communal sleeping areas ensured that privacy was impossible. Snoring illness and nightmares became shared experiences that disrupted everyone's sleep. Beds consisted of simple straw mattresses that provided little cushioning against hard wooden or stone platforms. Pillows, when permitted, were small and stuffed with rough materials that offered minimal comfort. Blankets were thin and inadequate for the climate, and monks were often required to sleep fully clothed to maintain modesty and be ready for nighttime prayer services. The straw in mattresses was changed infrequently and quickly became infested with insects and vermin. Fleas, lice and other parasites were constant companions that caused itching infections and the spread of diseases throughout the community. But complaining about these conditions was considered a form of spiritual weakness. Nighttime bathroom facilities were primitive and often located far from the sleeping areas. Monks who needed to relieve themselves during the night had to walk through cold, dark corridors to reach latrines that were essentially holes in the ground with minimal privacy or sanitation. The fear of accidents Embarrassment or getting lost in the dark created additional anxiety and sleep disruption. Winter nights were particularly brutal, as monks shivered under inadequate bedding in unheated dormitories, where temperatures often dropped below freezing ice would form on water basins, and monks' breath would be visible in clouds throughout the sleeping areas. But requesting additional warmth was considered a luxury inappropriate for those who had vowed poverty. Summer brought different but equally unpleasant sleeping conditions, as the same stone buildings that were freezing in winter became oppressively hot and stuffy during warm weather. Insects thrived in the close quarters, and the lack of ventilation created air quality problems that made sleep fitful and uncomfortable. The refectories where monks took their meals were designed to reinforce the message that eating was a necessary evil rather than a pleasure. Long wooden tables and hard benches provided uncomfortable seating for meals that were consumed in complete silence, while one monk read aloud from spiritual texts. The food itself was deliberately unpalatable, not just because of poor quality ingredients and primitive cooking methods, but because pleasure in eating was considered a sin that needed to be actively discouraged. Bread was often stale or mouldy, vegetables were overcooked and underseasoned, and any protein was typically salted, preserved, or otherwise treated to eliminate flavor. Portion sizes were calculated to provide just enough nutrition to prevent death, while ensuring that monks remained constantly aware of their hunger meals were served at specific times, regardless of whether monks had been engaged in heavy physical labor or were recovering from illness, and requesting additional food was considered gluttony, requiring confession and penance. Drinking water was often contaminated or scarce, and monks were forbidden to consume anything that might be considered pleasurable. Wine was permitted in small quantities during certain feast days, but drinking for enjoyment rather than pure necessity was discouraged and monitored. The process of eating itself was turned into a spiritual exercise. Monks were required to chew slowly and deliberately to avoid any appearance of eagerness or enjoyment. They were forbidden to express preferences for certain foods, or to eat with apparent pleasure, and their eating habits were constantly observed by superiors, looking for signs of gluttony or inappropriate attachment to worldly pleasures. Special fasting periods intensified these food-related torments during Lent Advent, and various saints' days, monks might receive only one meal per day consisting of bread and water, or they might be required to abstain from all food for extended periods, while continuing their normal work and prayer schedules. The combination of inadequate nutrition, hard physical labor, sleep deprivation, and constant stress created a feedback loop of physical and mental deterioration that was interpreted as spiritual progress. Monks became weak, irritable, and prone to illness, but these symptoms were seen as evidence that the flesh was being properly subdued, rather than as signs that human beings were being systematically destroyed. Medical care in monasteries was primitive and often counterproductive. Monks who fell ill were treated with prayer herbal remedies that were frequently harmful, and bloodletting that weakened already malnourished patients. Even further, the monastic understanding of medicine was heavily influenced by the belief that illness was often a result of sin requiring spiritual rather than physical treatment. The infirmary was typically a cold, poorly ventilated room, where sick monks were isolated from the community and left to recover or die with minimal care. Bedding was sparse, food was even more restricted than usual, and the primary treatment consisted of increased prayer and reduced physical comfort. Monks with chronic conditions like arthritis, digestive problems, or respiratory illness were expected to continue their normal duties, despite their symptoms. Requesting lighter work or modified schedules was considered a form of spiritual weakness, and sick monks were often subjected to increased penances to help them overcome their attachment to bodily comfort. Mental illness was completely misunderstood and typically attributed to demonic possession or lack of faith. Monks who suffered from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions were often subjected to exorcisms, increased fasting, and isolation that made their conditions worse rather than better. The monastery infirmary also served as a place where elderly monks spent their final years in conditions that were somehow even worse than the regular monastic routine. Old monks who could no longer perform manual labour were often given the most tedious and demoralising tasks like counting beans or sorting stones, while receiving reduced food rations because they were no longer productive members of the community. Death in monasteries was treated as just another form of spiritual discipline. Dying monks were expected to maintain proper religious observance until their final breath, confessing their sins, expressing gratitude for their suffering, and demonstrating appropriate detachment from worldly concerns. Even the process of dying was monitored and judged by superiors. Funeral arrangements were deliberately austere, with minimal ceremony and no individual recognition of the deceased monk's life or personality. The body was typically buried in unmarked graves in monastery cemeteries, where individual identity was erased in favour of collective anonymity. Even in death, monks were denied the basic human dignity of being remembered as individuals. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of monastic life was the way it systematically eliminated every source of joy, comfort and meaning that makes human existence tolerable. Music was restricted to religious chanting, art was limited to religious subjects, and any expression of creativity or individual personality was discouraged or forbidden. Monks were forbidden to form friendships, maintain correspondence with family members, or engage in conversations that weren't directly related to religious matters. They couldn't own personal possessions, pursue individual interests, or make any choices about how to spend their time. Even their inner lives were subjected to constant scrutiny through the practice of confession, where monks were required to reveal their private thoughts, desires, and struggles to superiors who used this information to assign additional penances and monitor spiritual progress. The goal was to eliminate any private space where individual identity might survive. Recreational activities were non-existent. Exercise was limited to necessary labour, and any form of entertainment or leisure was considered a dangerous distraction from spiritual duties. Monks lived in a state of constant, purposeful boredom that was designed to break down their psychological resistance to institutional control. The cumulative effect of all these daily torments was to create human beings who were so psychologically damaged and physically depleted that they became completely dependent on the institution that was destroying them. Monks lost the capacity for independent thought, decision-making, and emotional expression, becoming spiritual zombies who went through the motions of religious life without any genuine engagement or satisfaction. Yet the system was so effective at breaking down individual resistance that many monks genuinely believed they were experiencing spiritual growth and divine favour, even as their bodies, minds and spirits withered under the systematic abuse. They interpreted their suffering as evidence of God's love and their increasing inability to function as normal human beings as proof of their advancing holiness. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that even monks who managed to escape their monasteries often found themselves unable to function in ordinary society. They had been so completely institutionalized that freedom felt more terrifying than captivity, and many voluntarily returned to monastic life simply because they couldn't imagine any alternative way of existing. The few monks who did successfully transition to secular life often carried the psychological scars of their monastic experience for the rest of their lives. They struggled with depression, anxiety, and social dysfunction that made it difficult to form relationships, pursue careers, or find meaning in ordinary activities. Their stories rarely survive in historical records, because medieval society wasn't interested in documenting the human cost of its spiritual institutions. But occasional references in letters, chronicles, and legal documents hint at the widespread psychological damage that resulted from the monastic system. Modern historians have only recently begun to examine the actual lived experience of medieval monks, rather than the idealized accounts produced by the institutions themselves. This research reveals a pattern of systematic abuse that would be recognized today as a form of organized psychological torture designed to break down human personality and replace it with institutional compliance. The fact that this system operated for centuries with the full support of medieval society and the blessing of religious authorities demonstrates the power of ideology to justify even the most obvious forms of human cruelty when suffering is redefined as spiritual benefit and institutional control is presented as divine will. Almost any form of abuse can be rationalized and perpetuated. Yet even within this system of systematic dehumanization, there were occasional examples of monks who managed to maintain their humanity and find genuine spiritual meaning despite, rather than because of their institutional circumstances. These exceptional individuals succeeded by finding ways to transcend or subvert the more destructive aspects of monastic life while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Saints like Bernard of Clairvaux, Francis of Assisi, and Thomas Aquinas achieved spiritual and intellectual greatness, not because they embraced every aspect of monastic discipline, but because they were able to use the resources and opportunities provided by monastic communities, while avoiding the psychological destruction that claimed most of their contemporaries. Their success often depended on having sympathetic superiors, access to better living conditions, and opportunities for intellectual or pastoral work that provided meaning and purpose beyond the routine suffering that characterized ordinary monastic life. But these exceptional circumstances were available to very few monks and required a combination of personal charisma, political connections, and institutional luck that most monks never possessed. The majority of medieval monks lived and died in obscurity, their suffering serving no higher purpose than maintaining institutions that justified their existence through the production of more suffering. Their lives were sacrificed not to God, but to systems that claimed divine authority while practicing systematic human destruction. Understanding the reality of medieval monastic life helps us appreciate both the remarkable endurance of human beings under extreme duress and the dangerous power of ideologies that promise transcendence through suffering. While thousands of monks found ways to maintain their sanity and spiritual equilibrium despite their circumstances, many more were simply broken by systems that treated human beings as raw material for spiritual manufacturing. Their legacy should serve as a warning about the seductive appeal of institutions that offer certainty, meaning, and community in exchange for individual autonomy, personal dignity, and human happiness. The promise of salvation through surrender continues to attract people who are dissatisfied with the ambiguities and responsibilities of ordinary life. But the medieval monastic experiment demonstrates that such promises usually deliver suffering without salvation. Today, when we visit the ruins of medieval monasteries, we should remember not just the architectural beauty and cultural achievements associated with these institutions, but also the human cost of the spiritual ideals they represented. Thousands of men lived lives of unnecessary suffering in these buildings, believing they were serving God, while actually serving systems that consumed human beings to perpetuate themselves. Their stories remind us that good intentions are not enough to justify bad systems, and that institutions claiming divine sanction for human misery should be viewed with profound suspicion. The capacity to endure suffering is not the same as the wisdom to avoid unnecessary suffering, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for spiritual goals is not necessarily evidence of spiritual maturity. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval monastic experience teaches us that human dignity and spiritual development are not opposing forces that require choosing between worldly happiness and divine approval, but rather complementary aspects of a life well lived. Authentic spirituality enhances rather than destroys human flourishing, and any system that requires the systematic elimination of everything that makes life worth living has already abandoned the very values it claims to serve. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, surrounded by the comforts and freedoms that medieval monks never experienced, remember their sacrifice not as an inspiration for similar extremes, but as a reminder of the preciousness of the ordinary human dignities they were forced to surrender. Remember that tomorrow you will wake up free to make choices, express opinions, form relationships, and pursue happiness without having to justify these basic human needs. As compatible with spiritual development, you can be fully human and fully spiritual at the same time, something that medieval monasticism never understood and could never achieve. Sleep well, knowing that their long experiment in holy suffering is finally over, and that we have learned from their mistakes the lesson that love, whether human or divine, creates rather than destroys, enhances rather than diminishes, and liberates rather than enslaves those who serve it truly. May their rest be peaceful at last, and may we honour their memory not by repeating their sacrifices, but by building societies that recognise human dignity and spiritual growth as partners, rather than enemies, in the great work of creating lives worth living. Good night, and may your dreams be warmer, brighter and more human than anything medieval monasticism ever allowed.